to improving allocation of resources, to improve growth. But the reality is that distribution is very important in the EU budget, is paramount, in fact. And there is a bit of stabilization policy. Not full stabilization policy. When we think of stabilization policy, we think of fiscal policy, monetary policy. Yes, we have monetary policy, at least for those countries in the euro area, but we don't have a fiscal policy. So a very incomplete process of integration. Now, I think an important element when you look at policies, so far I've been talking mostly about integration, when we think of trade integration. What I think is also very important is that you need to keep, and we saw that with the EU member states in their history, you need to keep a coherence between the process of integration, of trade integration, the removal of barriers, and the macro side. The macro side means the exchange rate regime, the monetary and fiscal policies, and obviously depending on the kind of capital movement regime. Now, I'm not going to argue at all that one has to have, like what we have in Europe now, a single currency, that in a sense the process of integration cannot work. You cannot do trade integration unless at some stage you bring coherence by also having a single currency. Okay, the view of single market, single currency. I don't think it's necessarily required. I think in the case of Europe, for a variety of reasons, I think it was very, very useful. I think one can do it differently. What is the word that I want to emphasize is coherence. The policies need to be coherent. We saw that in Argentina and in the Mercosur. When there were problems there was clearly incoherence between the policies that were followed by Argentina within the Mercosur, and something had to give there, and it just did not work. Now, let me, in the last part of my presentation, let me not leave you with the impression that everything is rosy, that there are not many challenges. Yes, we have achieved a lot in 50 years. We have built, I think, institutions, as I've tried to describe. We have built common policies. There is clearly a common will to do things in common. So there is this political will that underpins the whole system. But I think there is also lots of economic, meaningful policies here. But there are clearly a number of challenges. And some of those challenges, we saw them through the crisis. And let me just go through 3 of the challenges that I think are important, and then I think I will have used my 20 minutes. The first challenge is that, that's perfect, 5 minutes. The first challenge is how to manage partial integration. I said at the beginning of my presentation that integration is a process. It's a process always in the making. And even though in Europe, again, we have had 50 years of integration, it's still a very partial, it's a very, very partial situation. Yes, we have a single market. Yes, we have a single currency. But there are a lot of other policies for which we do not have common policies. And I want to discuss that. How does that work and what are the challenges? Second issue is, we were 6 at the beginning. We are 27 now. We are much bigger and much more diverse. What are the implications of that? And then the third point that I want to discuss, and very briefly, is, yes, we have integrated a lot within Europe, but the world has also become much more integrated. We have had global integration. And how does Europe, with its partial process of integration, how does it relate to this process of global integration? Now, this here summarized in a sense for economic policies, both micro and macro, what are the policies which are at what level? And what I show here is that on the right, you have the micro policies. They are the single market. We have mobility of labor. We have mobility of capital. We have mobility of goods, of services. We have a single currency. But what we don't have a single single fiscal policy, and we do not have a single social policy. We have different social policies. We have different unemployment benefits. We have different retirement schemes. All of those things are different. And the question is, can a system like this work? And can it work smoothly? Where some of the policies have been allocated at the EU level, and some of the policies that are very much intertwined with the policies that are at the EU level have remained at the national level. Can you have a monetary policy at the EU level, or the euro area level, and fiscal policy at the national level? Now, that clearly is raising a number of issues. Okay? Yes, we do not have a single fiscal Europe. We do not have a single social Europe. Yet we have labor mobility. Now, how does that work? We have seen that in the crisis, we do not have a single financial supervisor. No, we have avoided, I think, major crises in Europe. We could have had, I think, a really, really major problem through the crisis if a large European bank had failed. Luckily, it was only, quote-unquote, an Icelandic bank that creates the problem, and we see the difficulty that we have there, because, you know, Iceland is integrated into a single market. So it's clear that we do not have all the tools, and that, you know, having integrated in certain areas but not having integrated in others, having the tools in some areas but not in others, is causing problem. Now, the magic word in Brussels is coordination. We'll coordinate, but the truth of the matter is coordination doesn't work very well. When you're in time of crisis and you need to coordinate, doesn't work very, very well. Issue of size and diversity. As I said before, we started with 6 countries with very little diversity among member states. Now we are 27. It's very, very large diversity. Now, diversity and numbers are posing 2 issues. One issue which has always been there is matter of convergence. Convergence, we understand convergence, integration, producing convergence. But there's always been a discussion of saying, should countries meet certain minimum standards in economic terms before they can join? Can the union function among countries that are very, very different? Okay? And initially, when we were only 6, the response was, okay, there were differences among countries. There were differences in wages, for instance, in labor standards, in social standards between countries. But the view was, okay, those differences are not so big. Integration itself will result in convergence. Little by little, as countries have become more diverse, we have put tests and said, you can only join if you are meeting certain criteria. And you see that in particular for monetary integration, you know, in order to enter into the monetary union, you have to fulfill certain economic criteria. So we have moved from a system where we view that integration will result in convergence to saying, first you need to converge to certain levels before you can join either the EU, was the case for the latest group of member states from the East, or certain criteria for monetary union. Diversity. Well, having more countries means more diversities of views. We would not have been able clearly to be at the point where we are now in Europe if we had started at 27. Imagine that those 27 countries had initially said, you know, they want to achieve what they were. It would have been impossible. Many of the policies they could have never agreed upon. So it was only done because it went gradually. Now the issue is, do we need certain flexibilities? Do all countries need to abide by the same kind of policies? And we have already given some flexibility in a sense. Not all countries have joined the monetary union. Even some countries have obtained opt-outs for the monetary union. So the view is that there are certain policies that you cannot be in the EU without abiding to those policies. But little by little, countries are accepting the view that not necessarily all policies need to be adopted by all countries, at least at the same time. And finally, that's my last slide, there is this issue of global integration. Europe has changed a lot over the last 50 years. The world has changed a lot over the last 50 years. And one of the big issues now for Europe, and the big narrative in Europe certainly, is, you know, Europe as a global player. And Europe is wanting to play a role in global governance, and new forms of global governance that are needed, the G20 and other fora. And Europe very much sees itself as a champion of multilateralism. It sees itself through its own experience as an excellent example of international governance. So, you know, we view that our own experience, the governance that we have achieved internally, is also something that we can bring internationally. But I think it's clear that we are facing major problems in being able to drive the global governance agenda. One is that our internal governance itself is partly deficient. We are, as I called elsewhere, a fragmented player. The way our policies have evolved through this process is very unequal in different areas. And the other is that we are very overrepresented in international institutions. Europe was there at the creation, as it were, with the United States, but many of the European countries were there at the creation. Now some of those countries need to vacate their seats and make room for a EU representation. Thanks.